it is difficult to believe that 20 years has passed. It's amazing that just how the way the time flies. And I mean, I remember 20 years ago, I was obviously a lot younger. Uh, but yes, it's amazing that 20 years have passed since that landmark indictment came down.
And of course, your involvement in the case began well before that. 7 years earlier, in looking again at your bio yesterday, you joined the FBI in '98, which is right around the time this case got started, right?
That's correct. Yes, I went to the FBI Academy in 1998 in March, and I got to the Chicago field office in June of 1998, and I started working on the organized crime squad in November of 1998. And yeah, Family Secrets was essentially, it was my second case that I had while I was on the organized crime squad. So I was assigned to it relatively early on. And I wasn't the case agent at the time. Mike Hartnett was the case agent, and I was basically assigned to help administrate the wiretap that we put in up at the prison up in Milan, Michigan. So I was new. I was 27 years old at the time.
When I talked to Frank Jr. last week, I asked him to tell the story about sitting down in that prison library and tapping out that letter to the FBI. And of course, he tells a great story about it and what motivated him and everything. Tell me about that letter, the receipt of that letter on your end. What was the reaction in the office when that came in?
So I wasn't actually on the squad at the time the letter came in. That letter came in July of 1998. So I wasn't on the squad yet, but I can tell you based upon my experience later when I got onto the squad, that letter was extremely important to the organized crime squad, to the organized crime program for the FBI. And there was a lot of excitement, but there was also a lot of secrecy associated with it. We did not tell very many people, as it specifically relates to Frankie and then later to Nick Calabrese when we were able to get him to cooperate. I mean, we never even used Frankie's name or Nick's name in the office at all. We had code names that we used for them. So we were very, very cognizant of the gravity of that letter, the gravity of the case, how big the case could be, and the potential for issues. We didn't want to let anything out because we knew that it could be extremely dangerous for Frankie because Frankie was eventually going to be back out on the streets.
And I know that initially, when the letter was received, it was hard to believe. I guess there was some skepticism that it was real or what the motivations were behind it, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in any case that you have when something like that comes in, you certainly are skeptical of what are the motivations? Is this even real? So yes, there was a lot of that, but then once that got vetted out, uh, yeah, we were ready to go.
And you were one of the people going to Milan, I understand, right? To
That
set up
is
the recording. Tell me about that experience. What was that like?
Yes, that's correct. So I mean, there were two sets of recordings that we were doing. One, we were recording Frankie. We were putting a wire on Frankie to make consensual recordings with his father. And then in addition to that, we were putting in a wiretap actually in the prison visiting room to capture conversations between Frank Calabrese and Anthony Doyle and Mike Rickey, the two. Anthony Doyle was with the Chicago Police Department, and Mike Rickey was with the County Sheriff's Department. So, I mean, there were two vastly different experiences associated with that because when we were putting wires on Frankie, it was a very nerve wracking time. And I'm sure Frankie discussed this with you, but prisons are full of concrete walls. And so, unlike the TV shows, we could not actually listen to the recordings as they were occurring when Frankie was wearing a wire. So we put a microphone on him and send him on his way. And as I've said before to other folks, that if something went wrong, we had no idea because we couldn't monitor him while he was actually out on the yard. So it was a lot of nervous waiting time from the time that we would put the wire on Frankie till the time that he came back. So it was a fantastic experience as an FBI agent, as an investigator. It's kind of the stuff that you dream of doing uh, when you're at the FBI Academy, but also you don't realize how nerve-wracking it can actually be.
It was extremely dangerous for him too, right?
Absolutely. There again, we didn't have eyes on him. We couldn't see where he was going, who he was interacting with. I mean, there are instances that his father tried to actually lift up his shirt while he was wearing a wire. Frankie was able to avoid that happening, which could have been catastrophic because as Frankie explained to us when he came back to meet with us, that there were um, other members of organized crime, there were gang members there, all in the area in the yard, and so had they seen that he was wearing a wire, it would have not gone very well for him.
What was the reaction among the team and the case agents when you were able to listen to the recordings that were being made?
It was the amount of information on those recordings was phenomenal. We were astounded at how Frank Calabrese would talk about the homicides that he was involved in. Uh, just the amount of information that he was providing, the detail on some of the most horrific crimes that you can imagine. We were taken aback when we got these recordings.
I mean, a lot of these were murders that had occurred many years earlier and had been unsolved for decades. This this unlocked everything, didn't it?
It did. Well, yes and no. So it was the catalyst to unlocking all of these murders. The murders charged in family secrets ranged from the murder of Michael Albergo, which occurred in 1969, if I remember correctly. And then the last murder was the 1986 murder of John Fecarata. So you are correct that these murders were obviously cold cases, uh, didn't know who had committed them. And so it was the recordings provided us with an insight as to what happened. Frank talked about the Michael Albergo murder where they buried Michael Albergo's body in what is now a parking lot down at White Sox Park. So those recordings were able to allow us to then use some of that information when we were able to flip Nick Calabrese. And then once Nick began to cooperate, that's when an avalanche of information came forward.
And how did that work? Once you had the recordings, what did you say to Nick, or how did you approach Nick to make him understand the position he was suddenly in?
So the approach that was made on Nick was not made by myself. It was made by Tom Bourgeois, who was my supervisor at the time, who had been the case agent when they initially indicted the Calabrese family for juice loans back in 1995. But so it was Mike Hartnett and Tom Bourgeois. And so they didn't approach him with the tapes. As a matter of fact, we didn't even discuss the tapes with Nick for, Nick never heard the tapes at all. So I don't even, as I'm sitting here thinking now, I don't remember that we ever, even up until or after the indictments, or trial for that fact, Nick didn't know what was on the tapes because when we first approached Nick, we didn't want to let Nick know that Frankie was cooperating. So what was basically approached to Nick is that they had a DNA search warrant for his DNA because his DNA was left on the gloves at the Fecarata murder scene. So they approached him with that, and then they did an X-ray of his arm because we had known that during the course of the Fecarata homicide that he had actually shot himself. One of the bullets that hit John Fecarata actually went through Nick's arm first and then hit John Fecarata. So Nick had some damage to his arm. So that was the approach. Basically, we have a search warrant for your DNA. We have a search warrant to take x-rays of your arm, and you're looking at the death penalty. So now the choice is yours. And that initial meeting, he did not cooperate at all. Had nothing to say, really, just held tight. And it probably didn't hurt for him to hold tight because Jimmy Marcello was paying him $4,000 or $5,000 a month to keep his mouth shut. So that tends to make people not want to talk.
Yeah, Frank is very candid about why he decided to go against his dad and why he decided to cooperate. It was the poisonous relationship. But why do you think Nick eventually turned? What was it? Was it just the situation he was in terms of being held responsible for that murder? Or did he also come to see maybe seek revenge on his brother in some sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't say revenge. No, I think that the relationship with his brother was a huge motivating factor in his final decision to cooperate. Obviously, he's looking at, a potential death sentence for the homicides that he was involved in, but I don't think that was the motivating factor. I think that he felt that Frank treated him so poorly that it was just he had had enough. That's what I think the motivating factor was. The breakdown of the relationship between Frank Sr. and Nick, because Frank was not a very good brother to Nick in any way, shape, or form. He treated him poorly. Obviously, he brought him into a criminal enterprise, which I don't have a brother, but I don't think that I would bring my brother, if I had one, into a criminal organization like that. But just the overall interaction between those two just broke down so much over the course of time that Nick had had enough and realized that I'm not going to stand up for my brother. He's a horrible person, and I'm not doing it.
Tell me about the name the case eventually earned, Family Secrets. How did that come about, and what does it signify?
Well, Family Secrets. So I don't know now, since I'm not with the FBI now. I can't say how they pick out case names, but back
Mm-hmm.
then you had to basically make a request for an operation name, right? Because most cases don't have an operation name. They'll have a case number, and then they will also have the designation, the name of the subject or the name of the victim. So we had to make a special request back to FBI headquarters, and we listed out a number of names on them. And Family Secrets actually was not, as I recall, was not one of the names initially put on the first set of potential operation names. And so eventually the names were pulled down. And I can't remember who came up with the name Family Secrets. Somebody in the squad came up with it. As I sit here now, obviously it's a long time ago, but it obviously is a good case name for this particular case. We focused on using the term family because it was the Calabrese family plus the organized crime family. So we thought that was relatively appropriate. But the secrets, honestly, I don't know who came up with that, but it basically was then submitted to headquarters, and headquarters gave us the thumbs up. So it worked out. I just don't have any good explanation for you as to how the whole thing came about.
And you touched on one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, which I've always been fascinated by this case. It really was that I used the word before, poisonous relationship between Frank Sr. and Jr. and Frank Sr. and Nick, that this whole thing could have just been limited to their family, but it expanded far beyond their family. Tell me about that. I mean, it started with the Calabrese family, but it wound up taking down several major longtime members of the Chicago outfit.
Yes. And I mean, that was so initially, you are correct. Initially, the focus was on Frank Calabrese because that's who Frank Calabrese Sr., because that's who Frank Jr. was cooperating against. That's who the tapes we had on. He was discussing his involvement in these murders. But then once Nick cooperated, it expanded the entire investigation. I mean, I remember when we first sat down with Nick when we were in the prison with him in Ashland, Kentucky. That was the first time that Nick had actually been debriefed relating to his involvement. And he began talking about the murder of Michael Cagnoni, which was he was a business owner whose car was blown up as he was entering the 294. And so once he began that process of telling us about one murder after the next and the members of organized crime that were involved in it, that's when we realized that we had to expand. Our investigation was going to expand 10, 20 fold. So that's really Nick's involvement is where it started to, expand. And then in addition to that, we had, so there was two organized crime squads working at the same time. There was OC1, which I was on, and then OC2, which there were two case agents, Ted McNamara and Anita Stammet, were working on another wiretap against Jimmy Marcello. And so we ended up coming together to work together because Jimmy is obviously somebody that Nick is talking about being involved in homicides. And so we ended up, two squads came together to start to work in conjunction with one another. So, but Nick was the real catalyst to expand the investigation.
Looking back on it now from 20 years since the charges were filed, what do you think is the legacy of the family secrets case?
Well, I think the legacy is that it shows that the work that the federal government does to dismantle these criminal organizations. I mean, prior to the family secrets case, the Chicago organized crime family, the outfit, had only been there. The cases that were brought against them were crew related. So you'd have a case against the Elmwood Park crew or against the Chinatown crew. But this case showed that we could work to take down the entire organization and the hierarchy of the organization. Um, and so I also think another legacy of this investigation and case was for the first time we were able to get restitution for the victims' families. That had never been done before. So we did raids on Frank Calabrese's house after the case was over, after he had been convicted, where we pulled out millions of dollars in jewels and in cash, and we were able to take those funds and then return that to some of the victims' families who had been, for years not even known what happened to their family members or the why. And now we're able to, we'll never make them whole, but at least we're able to do something to help those victims' families. So I think that's the legacy from this case, to not only take down the entire organization, but also to remember that they're victims. Uh, and those victims' families, they live with this forever.
They still do, I know. Um, I know you're no longer in Chicago. I'm sure you keep your ear to the ground. But what did the case do in terms of damaging the capabilities of the Chicago outfit? Does it even exist today?
I mean, look, I think organized crime will always exist. I don't think it will ever go away completely. I think it has to change and adapt to the times. But I think what Operation Family Secrets did, it was the end of the old guard, if you will, as it relates to the Chicago outfit. I mean, the Chicago outfit was able to have such a hold on Chicago for so many years due to the connections that they had in law enforcement, in politics. And so those connection, I believe, were severed severely once you take out the upper echelon of the organization. And when you do that, it also creates a void for leadership. And so I think that those individuals who are accomplished, if you will, in that organized crime life, once they're removed, it takes a long time for them to fill back in. And one of the things with the Chicago outfit, unlike other organized crime families, specifically New York, and this is coming from Nick, is that they didn't make people, they didn't bring up people into the leadership roles like they do in New York. It was a very small, tight-knit group of made members. And so when you take out a number of those made members and send them to jail for life, and you haven't brought new people up, it really weakens the organization in total. So that's what I think the effect is to basically weaken organized crime, specifically the outfit.
I asked this question of Marcus, and I'll ask it of you because you dealt with Nick Calabrese. There are a lot of people that think that he should have died in prison. He didn't. He got out towards the end of his life and spent, according to Frank Jr., a few number of years with family. Although Frank Jr. said he was never at peace. He was haunted by what he had gone through. What do you say to people that say that Nick should have rotted in prison for the rest of his life, having committed all those murders that he committed?
I can't disagree with anyone that would say that. That is a very difficult point. That's a very difficult discussion to have, because I know the family members of all of these victims were extremely upset, and I would be upset as well. If my family member had been murdered by Nick Calabrese, I would never want him to ever be out on the streets, ever. So I think that in this particular case, Judge Zagel had an extremely difficult job to do. And I think Judge Zagel did the best that he could under the circumstances, because in Nick's sentencing, Judge Zagel basically said, like, look, he's a significant cooperator, and without this cooperation from Nick, how many of these families would have never known what happened to their family members or the why? And so the other balancing factor that has to come into play is, if someone like Nick Calabrese cooperates, and he's the first made member to testify against this, a horrible criminal organization, if he is not given consideration for that and is put in jail for the rest of his life, do other cooperators ever come forward? So I can't ever say to a victim's family that Nick should have gotten out, because in all rights, he shouldn't have. However, there's that balancing test, and I'm glad that I don't and didn't have to wear a black robe. That's a job that I don't want, and is an extremely difficult job. So that would be my answer, is that should he have spent the rest of his life in jail? Absolutely. However, there's a balancing that has to go on under those circumstances. So that's how I tackle it. That's how I
Yeah.
think of it, because
It is
I spent a lot of time with Nick. So yeah.
it is an interesting moral dilemma. And there's no right or wrong answer, really. It just kind of turned out the way it turned out. Final question, Michael, is tell me about what you're doing these days in terms of this case. I guess you do some lectures occasionally with Frank.
That's
And
correct.
as part of tell me about what you do, and tell me why you think people are still fascinated by this case. Even 20 years on, 18 years since the trial, several years since many of the players here have passed away. There's still a public fascination with family secrets.
So currently what I do is occasionally I will get a call from Frankie, and he will ask me to come out to the mob museum where he is currently employed. And the mob museum has Frankie and I give presentations relating to this case. And I think that the reason that it is so interesting to people is there's a multitude of factors. First is that you have organized crime. And I think that there is just a lure about, or a folklore around organized crime cases and families, and I think that people are just fascinated by it, and always have been and always will be. I think the other reason is because of the uptick in people interested in true crime. I think that now has, I mean, there's thousands of podcasts. Every time you turn on Netflix, there's a new, whodunit show or a new documentary on some particular true crime case. So I think that's another factor. And I think thirdly, when you have the dynamic of a son who cooperates against a father and wears a wire against his own father, and then causes an uncle to flip against a brother. I think when you combine all of those factors, it just becomes a story that some people just will sit and listen to. I mean, where I'm at now, when I talk to people just in casual conversations, they want to hear more and more and more of the family secret story, just because of the entire dynamic that you're dealing with from the family side of it and the crime side of it. So I think when you merge all of those together, I think that's why you have such an interest from people 20 years gone by that still are interested in hearing about murders that happened in 1969, hearing about just the exploits of the Chicago outfit over the course of years. I think that people find that fascinating, and I think they always will find it fascinating. I think it becomes timeless in a certain fashion.
I've always said it's the most Shakespearean mob story I've ever heard. And I've always been amazed that and maybe it'll still happen, that there hasn't been some sort of a movie, a Scorsese type movie made out of it. I mean, the plot material is just so rich for exploration. Hopefully, it
I
happens
would
one
agree.
day.
I would agree. It is. There are lots of interesting moments that can be captured, and I think would people would find it very interesting on the screen. But I mean, that's the next question is you've had so many mob movies that are out there, can you make this different than another one? So that's not my job. I don't know how to do that. I
Yeah.
am not a movie producer or director or anything like that. I just go try to catch bad guys. That's what I try to do.